Afternoon, everyone. My name's Chris Deerin, Director of Reform Scotland, and welcome to our latest election event. With the Holyrood election approaching, the spotlight in recent days has begun to turn onto the economy, and not before time, we might think. Many of you will be aware of today's new report from Oxford Economics, commissioned by Sir Tom Hunter, which examines Scotland's low productivity and its causes. And one of its findings is that Scottish politicians are good at finding ways to spend money, but not so good at finding ways to make it, which is probably no surprise to anyone on this call. It talks too about the new wave of renewable energy tech, and that being an opportunity for Scotland. And indeed, we'll be producing some new work and holding an event on that subject in the next few weeks. Economic growth, wealth creation, productivity are themes that I've regularly heard today's guest speak about. Malcolm Offord is not only a successful businessman with a long and illustrious history in the financial sector, he also has a keen policy brain and a strong sense of social responsibility, and I think that's probably why he's decided to stand in this year's election for the Scottish Parliament on the Lothian list for the Conservatives. It struck me how few people with Malcolm's professional background and expertise get involved in Scottish politics, and I think this makes him something of a rare beast. And so, given Reform Scotland's focus on prosperity, innovation and wealth creation, I thought it would be fascinating to hear from him with the election nearly upon us. In a minute, Malcolm will talk about his ideas for turbo boosting the economy, and then we can all have a chat about that. I'd also like to ask him in due course about why he's standing and what he hopes to achieve. After all, the story of successful business people making the move into politics is something of a mixed one. For every Sajid Javid and Kate Bingham, there's a Digby Jones and a Dido Harding, or indeed a Donald Trump. I suppose whether he's a success or a failure depends on your own preferences. But it's clear, I think, that we could do with more successful business people and economic expertise at Holyrood. The standard of economic debate there is not always high, and we need those that understand and appreciate the private sector and who have some scars on their backs from their experiences in it as well, and I'm sure that Malcolm is one of those. The game playing and compromises involved in a political career don't always sit easily with those used to thinking about the bottom line. So how might we go about changing that? Again, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the relationship between business and politics as we go. Just a little bit more about Malcolm before he takes the floor. He's originally from Greenock. Is chairman of the Edinburgh-based investment company Badenoch & Co, and previously worked at Lazard, 3i, Bankers Trust and Charterhouse. He is also regent of Edinburgh University, a trustee of the Duke of Edinburgh Award and chair of London Scottish Rugby. So again, if you can mute yourself if you're not talking, please do send questions at any point using the message gizmo on your Zoom screen. It'll work a lot better if we make this something of a conversation. And I'll hand over to you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Chris, very much. Thanks for the introduction, and good to see so many well-kent faces on the call. The topic that we're going to discuss today is how to turbocharge Scotland's economy. And we're going to start off just by getting the facts and figures right. You all know these facts and figures very well. They come from the GERS report. GERS was first published in '92. It's published annually since '95. There's no real dispute over the authority of GERS figures, even on the SNP side. You know, Alex Salmond, John Swinney, Andrew Wilson have all endorsed GERS as being the right framework for discussion around the economy. And they were just the most recent ones published August last year, obviously made very uncomfortable reading for the SNP, for all of us, in fact, that we've got a big deficit. And that actually the British dividend that comes up to from Westminster is now worth £2,000 effectively per man, woman and child in Scotland. So why is that? I mean, it's just simple math, obviously. Our annual running costs in Scotland are 81 billion. Our tax revenue is 66. So we've got a deficit of 15. We're on a salary of 66, we're spending 81 grand, and we've got a very benevolent bank manager giving us an overdraft of 15k per annum. Which comes into our direct account with no questions asked. Now, actually, interestingly, the discrepancy is more on the cost side. Our tax revenue is actually in line with our share population, so 8% population. We provide 8% of tax revenue to the UK, but our costs of running Scotland are higher, 9.2%. And that's why we have this deficit of 8.6, which is 3 times more than the UK as a whole. So the UK obviously manages all this, the block grant through the Treasury, the Barnett formula we all know about, 1979. It was anecdotally, it was back of a fact packet calculation, but it worked pretty well. And no one's come up with a better idea in 30 odd years, 40 years of doing it. So it persists to this day. And it's pretty good on the whole with the devolved administrations, because it pretty much works on last year's budget and then makes adjustments, increase or down, versus England, mostly for the other 3 Celtic countries. And it means that you don't, therefore, because you're a framework, you don't have protracted annual negotiations. It's relatively stable, predictable, and it also allows reasonable autonomy to the governments as to how they spend it. However, in England, the spotlight is now shining on the Barnett formula in a way that hasn't really been before. And what's showing is that it's a lot higher spending in the devolved nations than within England. And the fact is that the formula perhaps is not as flexible as it should be, because it embeds historical differences and it doesn't take account of population changes quite as fast as it should do. The result of that is that in Scotland, the bare fact of the matter is that we are spending 30% more per person in our cost base than we have in England. And my English pals say to me, you know, listen, Malky, you're a bright, canny Scot. None of us knew about this Barnett formula. And only in the last 10 years, since all your independence guys have got onto this, are we now looking at the numbers. And for the first time, we're saying, actually, we didn't realise this, that you're actually getting 30% more than we are in England. You know, please explain, please justify. And so in trying to explain that, there's one or two weapons that we can come back with. One is that if we look at the 12 regions of the UK, we're fourth in terms of prosperity. So after we obviously got London, South East, South West, we're like, you might say, the best of the rest. So we actually do quite well in prosperity. The issue we've got is back to the fact that it's our cost base that seems to be higher than average. The second point I make to my pals is, listen, the whole point of the UK is that we're one United Kingdom, and we have to take the disparities with that, and that we should therefore have the same level of public services, whether you live in Streatham as if you live in Stornoway. But it costs a lot more money to provide them in Stornoway than in Streatham. Therefore, the Barnett formula is not a subsidy. It's just an equalisation payment, because Scotland is more expensive to run. We have 8% of the population, we have 33% of the geography. It's just a fact that it's a more expensive country to run. And then the third thing perhaps we can say to our English pals is, look, it's not always been the case that we've been taking, we've had deficits, we've had surpluses in the past. And, you know, the embargoed papers out of the beleaguered governments of Heath and Wilson and even Thatcher, when she's taken on the unions, they were very grateful for the North Sea oil revenue that came into the Exchequer from Scotland. And I put in my article today that Kevin Haig's chart, which he's put out over 50 years, which basically shows on balance it's netted out, net. And maybe that is the whole point of the UK, is that net, we have checks and balances, we have overs and unders, but net, we end up in a place that we're flat. I mean, the thing here is that you know, the historians out there, why was the union created? The English had much motivation to create the union as did the Scots, and we don't want to go into the whole thing with the Deering scheme, etc. But England had worked out she couldn't defend herself without Scotland, and that England would benefit economically if she brought Scotland into the union, made some of the parts, you know, the whole greater than the sum of the parts. There's all sorts of game theory goes on. And there's one actually in today's edition of Effie Dean's, if any of you read it, which is this thing that Boris should just call Salmon's bluff and say, right, that's it, you're separating right now. So take your share of assets, take your share of debt, but no more access to currency, sterling, no more border, no common union with either the UK or the EU. That was the end of the vaccination programme, no more furlough. You're on your own and off you go and see how you get on. And we can't get access to international capital markets because we don't have a currency. So what do? We go off to the IMF, and the IMF comes in and imposes austerity on us we've never seen before in our life. Not even Greece had this sort of thing imposed on them. And you say, where's independence gone? You know, where's our independence gone that we've just had this imposed on us? And you can take it further if you want to by saying, you know, and if the IMF don't support Scotland, who does? And then you're into the Russians and the Chinese and their fleet being at Scapa Flow, etc., etc. So there are many reasons for why the English would want to keep the union together, economic as well as historical. But my point here is that this should not alleviate us as a country from the responsibility of running our economy better. And that should be an objective of any of us, whether we're unionists or nationalists. As a matter of national pride, we should actually try and run our economy better. And frankly, It's, as I said before, Jersey's only really been going since '95 continuously. It's only in the last 25 years that we are, as a country, perhaps getting a real focus on our own P&L. I mean, thinking back to the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, etc., there wasn't really any focus on that from either Labour or Tories. I mean, Labour governments in Westminster took the bloc Labour vote of 50 votes, propped up the English Labour Party and the Barnett formula. Thank you very much. The Tories weren't much better, really. At the end of the day, a series of patrician sort of Secretary of State, whether it was Lang or Younger or Rifkind, etc. As long as we were good citizens and we kept the union together, we got our block grant. But nobody, I think, really asked us the question about how do we take control and run our economy better for ourselves within the UK. And that's now the position we're at right now. And that's obviously now where the spotlight is now coming on this. And we've got an SNP government that have been in power for 14 years. And if you just go straight to the business side of how they've handled the economy, it's pretty shocking. It's pretty incompetent. It's pretty inept, actually. I mean, the stats are pretty horrific. The fact that in that 14-year period, England have grown employment by 15%, and we're only at 5%. Why should we be growing our employment at a third of the rate of England and half of that in Northern Ireland? Our productivity, mentioned earlier in today's report with the Hunter Foundation, we're running at 2/3 of the West Midlands, same population, same country. Why is that? Why are we allowing ourselves to run at that sort of level? We don't produce higher taxpayers. We need more higher taxpayers. In the UK, there's 1% of the population pay the ART, but they contribute 30% of the income tax. In Scotland, we've only got 0.5% of the population paying that rate, and it's only 16% of income tax. And then when you go through the whole roll call of state intervention, whether it's Prestwick Airport, or Ferguson Shipyards, or BiFab, or maybe even the steelworks in Lochaber, it is a pretty sorry track record of intervention, state intervention by the SNP government into business. And the question you ask yourself is, do they actually have any business acumen in government? So look, I would argue, it doesn't have to be this way, whatever your political persuasion, it doesn't have to be this way. And that any competent Scottish government post-pandemic needs to prioritise economic growth over any independence referendum, And what I want to talk about is a roadmap. How do we turbocharge Scotland's economy? And I've got 8 ideas. The question is why? Why bother? And funnily enough, 2 words, Chris, that you mentioned at the beginning, but actually don't get mentioned very often in party literature, and certainly weren't mentioned once, I think, in the TV debate last week. And those 2 words are wealth creation. There seems to be just a complete deficit of being able to talk about this subject. We've talked about the fact our costs are running ahead of our revenue by 15 billion. There's no appetite in this country to cut costs. Fine, okay. Well, in that case, let's get our income up. So if we can please have a national conversation about how we get our income up, right? So that's sort of where I really want to go with this. And the first one, the most obvious one, is can we please get our education sorted out? What has happened to that good old standard, the gold standard of Scottish education, where we've now gone down the table, PISA tables, you all know about that. You've covered this very well in Reform Scotland, and obviously the Commission of School Reform. I think Keir Bloomer's probably on the call here, and all the stats that we know about, where the Auditor General just came out and said that, kids that are getting, 5+ level 5 awards, it's 46% in lower income areas versus 82% in higher income areas. I mean, that's a national embarrassment, and that's incumbent on all of us to sort this out. I was quite interested that 2 Scottish entrepreneurs have actually dipped a toe into education in the last few years. One, obviously, Tom Hunter, that TV programme he did in 2016 with the BBC called Teaching Tom. And he concluded we suffer from a one-size-fits-all approach, and we need more leadership and more open-mindedness in Scotland to close the attainment gap. He went down south of the border, where we're now 1/3 of state schools is either now a free school or an academy. And he was astonished to find that the outstanding performance they're getting, especially in deprived and poorer neighbourhoods. And what he discovered was the best success is achieved where control is basically taken away from the dead hand of the local authority and given to ambitious local governors. who are ambitious for their own local school and therefore prepared to do things a bit differently. Now, the academy model has been fiercely resisted by teaching unions in Scotland. But so Tom asked the question then, look, if it works, why wouldn't we try it? And then Jim McCall, you've also done a series with Jim McCall, and it's brilliant. You know, his Newlands Junior College, you know, he created a monster. You might even say it was a monster success when he built that college up. A vocational school targeting 20% of the cohort that go NEET at 16, they drop out almost at 14. They go NEET, they might get involved with crime, they struggle in mainstream education. He took 25 of those kids between 14 and 16, and he worked on their skills, their technical skills, gave them mentoring, vocational skill training, and in 5 years, he managed to get a 100% success rate of getting 130 of them vulnerable young people into lifetime work. Now, the cost of this was £7,000 per person, per child, versus the £5,000 roughly on terms of the state budget. Okay, now to me, you know, is that worth it? Okay, it's higher, but surely that's worth it in terms of human cost and economic cost of going NEET. You know, tens of thousands of pounds in welfare later, maybe even prison costs. And, you know, all too predictably, the government, the Snp government refused to fund it after 5 years, closed it in 2019. Apparently the concept of an independent school receiving public money was too much for the teaching unions. And local authorities feel like it could be a trailblazer for English-style academies. I mean, really, you know, if this thing works, it's been proven to work, let's do it. I think we need a revolution in innovation, leadership, imagination in education. It's our specialist subject. We invented education in this country, right? We should be ashamed that Scottish state school education has fallen behind England and Wales for the first time in our history. You know, 1/5 of our statutory school leavers do not have positive destinations, and that leaves a massive wage scar, but a massive loss of potential for them as well in terms of their talent. We've got 250,000 kids living in poverty. A good education is the only way out, and that will boost their life chances and boost our economy. So this needs urgent attention. That would be my first signpost on the roadmap. The second one is just can we just get everybody into work? You know, there's just no need now for perennial unemployment in modern economies. You know, it's time to end unemployment once and for all. We know that the young people who go NEET at 16 never recover their earning power, and they sometimes become lifetime recipients of welfare. We know that it's a bad economic decision for the state to let that happen because we want them to be taxpayers, not welfare receivers. And we also know that unemployment does enormous damage to workers who find themselves de-skilled. You know, we've got the fourth industrial revolution coming like a freight train at us. You know, we've got reskilling required on a comprehensive level. You know, every citizen should have a lifetime education voucher, so you can go back into college and reskill. I mean, modern employees are going to work maybe 20 jobs in their lifetime versus the 2 of the previous generation. So let's have a reskilling opportunity, and let's get. There's plenty of jobs that can be done for the public good. That, you know, that clearly the pandemic has taught us one thing. It's taught us to value things in our communities more than just economics. It's taught us that having a caring community, having people help our young people, having people help our elderly people, there's no shortage of jobs that can be created. And those, let's get folk into work, because it's much easier to get a job when you've had a job and you can then move up in the ladder. So that would be my second big piece, is let's sort out employment. Third one is, so let's make a national plan for prosperity, and let's get a government department focused on this. So in the recent Smith Commission, I mean, this has not really been talked about or highlighted very much, but there's a little clause in there in the fine detail and the fine print that says that if we in Scotland can grow our tax revenues ahead of the average in the UK, we get to keep the surplus. So that seems to me a good thing to try and do. And like any other competitive Scot, let's have a competition. I would put a big billboard up at Harthill Services, and I'd get that graph. I'd get the graph going of the UK tax revenue, and then I'd plot a graph of Scottish tax revenue, and I get everybody focused on their journey back and forth on train or by car to work out how do we get our line above the UK. And let's get focused on that as a country. Let's have a conversation about that as a country, and let's be proud of that as a country. Next one, infrastructure. You know, that was a rather a sad letter that Sir Willie Lithgow wrote, trying to get to his place on the West Coast, and he can't get through because the Western Be Thankfuls crumbled again. you know, and he was saying that it was easier to get around Scotland in 1728 when General Wade was building the roads. Let's get our roads sorted out. Let's get our railways sorted out. We know that railways bring in, look at what's happened with the borders at railways. Let's reverse some of these breaching costs. Let's get 5G rollout. You know, President Biden, his flagship policy is a $2 trillion investment into the economy, very reminiscent of Roosevelt's New Deal. And he's talking about 20,000 miles of roads and 10,000 bridges. So if it's good for the America, it's good for us. Let's get the infrastructure sorted out. Point 5, immigration. So we've not had our fair share of immigration in the UK. If we had, our population would be 6.3, not 5.3 right now. Our population is aging, and we need more taxpayers. And we know that controlled immigration brings in high energy people, hard-working people. Roy Leckie, I think, is in the audience. He wrote an interesting piece for you recently about the Hong Kong Chinese. It's 3 million British overseas nationals. You know, why don't we have a plan to bring some of them to Scotland? And I know you've got a session coming up with Heather Macaulay on this. There's plenty of small countries around the world that really boosted their immigration. It can be done in a controlled way. Let's have a plan about it. Point 6, devolved corporation tax. Okay, so this is about more powers for Parliament. And that's a controversial subject. Nobody wants to talk about that, but this is an open season, so we can talk about it. When Holyrood first set up, it was only in a position where it raised 14% of what it spent, which is why Billy Connolly called it the wee pretended Parliament. Right now, today, it's spending 44% of what it raises. It raises 44% of what it spends. And corporation tax has just been devolved to Northern Ireland, so it could very easily be devolved to Scotland. That would get us to 55% of what we raise. And we crossed that magic 50%, but the Parliament is now raising more than half of what it spends. And that's called accountability. And we can't keep blaming Westminster all the time because we're actually raising our own money. And a pro-business administration could then do something really quite interesting. Design a bespoke regime of incentives to encourage entrepreneurs, inward investment, business startups, creating more higher rate taxpayers, creating more wealth. Coming back to the same 2 words the whole time. Number 7, exports, promote exports. So SMEs are the lifeblood of the Scottish economy. As we all know, most of our big tartan 100 have all gone. The big corporations have left the scene, but our SMEs are fantastic. And I'm an investor chairman in 2, one in Hoyk and one in Dalgety Bay. And I can't believe the quality of what we make in Scotland. And I don't think our people really understand how good they are. And we're very technical. We're a very technical nation. We're good at making things. We're good engineers. We're good at software. We're good at auditing. We're good at, you know, account lawyering and everything. But we seem to have this deficit when it comes to marketing, selling. Isn't that boasting? Is what I get. Isn't that boasting? We don't do that in Scotland. That's what the English do. Well, actually, marketing is actually about getting value for what we make, because the world is queuing up to buy products we make in Scotland. And I'm always battling to try and get this concept of confident pricing into our businesses, that we make good products. Let's not be ashamed of selling them well. And, let's not go into the whole why is Hoyt knitwear not as valuable as Italian knitwear when we actually make better product. So let's get a proper joined up campaign. My little thing is made in Scotland, sold abroad. Let's get a campaign behind that to get exports going again, to create wealth. And the last piece is create a sovereign wealth fund. Again, there's nothing new here. The Scottish National Investment Bank has now been set up, but it could be much more ambitious to actively manage investments in strategic industries on behalf of the taxpayer, so long as it's on an arm's length basis from the politicians, and so long as it's actively managed by independent managers, we could build wealth for the nation. And Alan McFarlane and Andrew Wilson have done a piece for Reform Scotland on this. There's a whole ecosystem that we should create around this. And it's not rocket science. It's been done in Norway. It's been done in Singapore. We were the Scots guys that invented 3i. I worked at 3i a couple of years back then. It was ICFC in 1948. We've got a track record of innovation in financial services. Let's get back on it again and let's innovate. So what you get with this, I think, is actually, what am I putting out here? It's a wee roadmap to prosperity, and it's just not rocket science. It's all achievable. I don't even think it's actually party political. We can argue afterwards about how we distribute our surpluses, but can we please start? Can we just start by making one? And I think there's a consensus around that. And again, if you look in the Hunter report, if you look in the Hunter report, you're going to find the same proposals being put forward. There's no copyright on this. This is, I think, reasonable common sense. The challenge is, how do we get our politicians to understand and implement this? And that's maybe something we can come on to with you, Chris, a little bit later on. But that brings us finally to the SNP government. And I sort of think, 14 years in power, what a missed opportunity for them to fulfill their dream. They've had 14, they could have implemented all of this in the last 14 years, quite easily, okay? And if they'd come to power with a strategy that said, look, let's not mention the independence word. Let's just make sure that every area that we govern, we do better than was ever done before by Labour or Tory or Westminster. So every KPI that we've got control of will go up, not down. Education, health, roads. Let's make it better. We can then turn around in 10 years' time and say, look how well we've done. And that was unlimited powers. Just think how much better we could do if we had full powers, right? But they haven't done that because they've actually not been, I think, a government. They've actually just been an opposition. And the result of that is that every KPI that we talk about has gone backwards and not forwards. And so actually, ironically, if they'd actually focused on the day job of making Scotland more prosperous, they might be within touching distance of the magic 3% deficit that they need to get Scotland into the EU. We're sitting at 8.6, 3% is the target. Of the EU 27, the least performing country is Romania, and it's got 4.3. So Scotland's sitting at double worse than Romania, which is the outlier of the 27. And the hard reality says there's no circumstances in which the EU is about to step in and replace this 15 billion dividend funded by the UK. And the other big issue is, in the absence of a trusted currency, an independent Scotland won't be able to balance its books for at least a generation. Sterling is a silver bullet of the UK, which gives Scotland access to international capital markets, money markets at scale and pricing we could never achieve that on an independent basis, certainly not in a lifetime. Sterling's been around for 330 years, never once defaulted, ever. That's why it is the silver bullet of the UK, because it allows governments to borrow ahead of growth, and it allows us to get through peaks and troughs. It's the Achilles heel of the nationalist movement. There needs to be a lot more focus on the single issue of currency. So, I say to my nationalist friends, look, of course Scotland can be an independent country. Of course it could. But you haven't prepared us for this. You haven't set us up for this. You haven't prepared us for us in a responsible way in these 14 years. And that's why the Andrew Smith Growth Commission at the end of the day said it's going to take 10 years of austerity in order to get, they could have done the planning in the previous 10 years. So I say, look, I want to improve our prosperity and make our country fairer from our own parliament in Holyrood, with our own politicians doing that in Holyrood. But I say that we can achieve it much better by staying inside the UK, because the UK gives us all the tools, and especially sterling, that we can achieve. We can run our own affairs, but we can do it much better than the UK and with sterling. So I'm just going to finish now by, just to say, look, we've talked a lot about facts and figures and aspiration, and we can go into this a bit more in the QA. But at the end of the day, what is life all about? What makes life worthwhile? And the answer is, it's our families and our communities. And the UK, I would say, is a family. I've written a number of pieces on this, and I talk about the metaphor of a grand cathedral, where you've got 4 home nations that commune together. 4 distinct communities, but one united congregation. And we sit under the one roof of this cathedral, and it's held up by 7 sturdy pillars. And those 7 pillars are the Barnett formula: the NHS, pensions, defence, international affairs, monarchy, and the great central steeple of all is sterling. But it's more than that. Ultimately, it's all about our families. And throughout every corner of the UK, our families are intertwined, bringing diversity and vibrancy intermarried. You add in our international cousins from the Commonwealth. I would say Britain is indeed a rainbow nation, united by values of family, decency, tolerance, community. We share resources, we help each other, we ensure that being British is greater than the sum of the parts. And that is why investors are queuing up to buy our gilts. The nation that just won the vaccine race is a nation worth investing in, is it not? So, of course, we Scots will compete like hell to beat the English in every sporting and cultural endeavour. But we also know our grandparents fought and died together. They ate and drank together. They married and loved together. And there's no room for borders on this amazing island of ours. And there's no case for separation when we can build a more prosperous and fairer Scotland inside the UK. And finally, I'm sorry, but just because you don't like Boris, it's not a good enough reason for leaving, right? First of all, Boris is not a typical Englishman. And second, Prime Ministers come and go. So far, we've shared 55 of them, 11 of them Scottish, in this 314-year union, and some are better than others. So I think enough of the petty politics between Boris and Nicola. It's not the basis to make any long-term decision. I would say let's raise our game and get the best of both worlds by managing better our own domestic affairs in Holyrood, but retaining all the benefits of the UK, and once again punching above our weight inside the UK. The Nationalists know in their hearts there's no way an independent Scotland can offer her people the same level of prosperity or fairness as guaranteed by the UK. Yes, of course, Scotland can make that unilateral decision. And yes, I agree that money should never be the only reason to stay in an unhappy marriage. But be sure, before you close that door, before you roll these dice, please think twice. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. I felt like I should start to fade in the national anthem there as you were coming to the end. Rousing Churchillian rhetoric, most enjoyable. I thought that you know, towards the end of your speech, you were touching on, I think, what's my favourite political quote, which was Norman Kirk, who was the Labour Prime Minister of New Zealand, who said basically, all politics is about someone to love, somewhere to live, somewhere to work, and something to hope for. And regardless of whether we are independent or part of the union or whatever, it all really does boil down to those four simple facts, even if it gets more complex in the delivery. So I'd like to ask you a few questions. Can you, the rest of you, just send, we've got the beginnings of a conversation now taking place on the message board. So just keep that coming, and we'll put some of those questions to Malcolm in due course, and feel free to range widely across what he said. Feel free to provoke, feel free to have a go. Just keep the language decent, please. The first thing I'd like to ask Malcolm, just stepping away slightly from the policy stuff first, is why did you decide to stand for Holyrood, and why are there so few people like you doing it?
Well, I think I decided to stand because I was told to stop shouting at the telly. And eventually you have to put your hand up and say, you know what, I've got to have a go at this. I don't hear all of what I've said here today. I don't hear it in the national conversation. I don't hear it in Holyrood. Don't even hear much of it in Westminster. So therefore, if I want to say this, I've got something to say, then perhaps I should test out whether that is of any appeal. It is an unusual decision, isn't it? But it shouldn't be, because we should actually have we should have more cross-pollination, I think, in our politics with business than we do at the moment. We've gone down the road of professional politicians, effectively grooming from the age of 16, 18, becoming local councillors, off you go and through the system. And actually, we need more of a bridge, I would say, between both sides of the equation. For business people, at the end of the day, most of them will probably have to take a pay cut to go in. And that's a good thing, because then you've got somebody who's doing it for public service rather than for money. They're also very busy doing multiple things and making a great contribution by being plural, etc., in society. And frankly, they don't have the appetite for the Punch and Judy type stuff that goes on in politics. Business also tends to be a bit of a command and control environment. And that's why, someone like Archie Norman just really struggled when he was, trying to do the health brief. And opposite him was that very big hairy man, Dobson, who kept on answering back. And Archie was never used to anyone answering back. He sits in the boardroom and tells people what to do, So actually, it's a different sort of environment that business people are not necessarily comfortable in. We'll see. We'll see. But I'll put that in the ring, so we'll see how we go on.
I suppose, though, your point about Archie Norman is a good one, and one might think that you wouldn't necessarily be all that different from that kind of character if you were introduced. I mentioned in my introduction about some of the business people who've managed to make the transition to politics. It sometimes feels like more don't, and at least part of that must be to do with the fact that they're previous lives, the really successful ones have been running things. They've been running companies. They have been telling people what to do. They've been pursuing something that is, about the bottom line. There's a pureness to it. There's no the compromises and strategy of politics isn't quite the same thing. And if you go in there and you find yourself being told what to do by someone because you're the deputy health spokesman of the Scottish Conservatives or something equivalent, how long do you think you'd last? Think about Adam Tompkins, who went into the Parliament last time from, distinguished professor of Constitution at Glasgow University, and has given it up after one term, I think largely because he struggled with the structures and the demands that politics put on him intellectually. Is that something you've given any thought to?
Well, yes, but I'm not looking for a career. And I might even say I only want to do this for 5 years because it just needs 5 years to make this impact. We need to make an impact immediately on this conversation around the economy, and we need to make an impact around solving possibly once and for all the question of independence or not. And so, in a way, there's a moment in time right now that is appealing to me to get involved because I think I've got something to say. And I think if I can sit in the pub, sadly we're not allowed to do that, but if I can sit in the pub in Greenock with a bunch of what used to be called working class people and sit and talk them through the economy, they get it quickly, very quickly. It's just no one speaking their language. So let's not have this economy thing as being some sort of dark art or magic box only available to the elite. That's nonsense. This is everybody's everyday life, and we need to get this. I think we need to get this message across, and we need to fix it. And those things I've put down, those 8 things, they're all relatively straightforward, and they could all be done very, very quickly if there's a will.
What happened to the relationship between Scottish politics and Scottish business? So, we treasure our public sector in Scotland, and we talk a lot about it, and we applaud them on the doorsteps and whatever. But as you rightly said at the start, words like wealth creation and entrepreneurship and innovation and failure, an important word in the business circle, the sort of politicians shrink back from that kind of talk in Scotland. I mean, even the Conservatives are not out there shouting from the rooftops about a vibrant private sector. A lot of the time they're engaging in the chat about the public sector. What's happened between the two sides? The private sector is every bit as important, if not more important in some ways, than the public sector, and yet we seem to value one so much more than the other.
Yes, look, there is this concept, and Alex Salmon talks a lot about why we're different from the English, because we have this thing called the common weal, right? And that we want a much fairer society, and we want a more egalitarian society, and we don't want the extremes of rich and poor, etc., that you get in pure capitalist countries. And I think that is very much our tradition. But it's interesting that right now we're running that society. The nationalists tell us we don't have that, but we're proving the point that right now we have that because our costs are 81 and our income is 66. So we are actually running costs, a much higher cost base in Scotland than we are in England, because apparently we're a more caring society and we value our public services more. That's fine. There's no argument to try and reduce the cost. My argument is, how do we pay for it? How do we close the gap of how we pay for it? And that needs to come from the private sector. That needs to come from wealth creation. And again, the conversation just has to be that the more the private sector contributes, the better it is for everybody. So rather than demonizing that as being something that we don't talk about, we should celebrate the private sector. The better it is, the more it contributes, the more tax revenue it gets. Back to that thing on Heart Hill Services. Let's get our line going above the UK.
Okay. I'd like to move on to just some questions from the audience now. Peter, Devinka, I think your question's kind of been answered maybe in what we've talked about. So I'll maybe just move on to Hilary Silito. Hilary, are you there? Give us your question.
I've put two on. Yeah, the first one was, has Holyrood and Scottish business between them got all the levers that they need to do what you're suggesting?
Almost. I mean, if you went back to the Strathclyde Commission of the Tories put together, believe it or not, on how you boost Holyrood, they went further. They would say, go further than just corporation tax. If you actually included VAT, for example, that we couldn't do when we were in the EU. We weren't allowed to do that when we were in the EU. But as a result of Brexit, we can now allocate VAT, for example, between the 4 countries. That would get the Parliament up to raising 84% of what it spent. So that's not that far away if you want to go down that road. And at that point, you're effectively saying, look, the UK runs our international affairs, as we said before, our defence, the Five Eyes, our UN security, all that is UK land. But we're effectively managing and running and raising our own revenue to manage our local affairs in Scotland. And that to me would be a balanced picture. And it may not be quite there yet. And many people are dead against the idea of any more powers coming up to Scotland, and because the argument being in the last 14 years, we haven't shown that we can be responsible for what we've been given already. I get those arguments, but putting party politics to one side, Holyrood as a vehicle is not far away from being in a position where it's running a balanced, it could be running a balanced economy, and then focus entirely on its own business of making Scotland more prosperous and more fair.
Okay, Charlie Rayburn. Are you with us, Charlie?
Hello, yeah.
Hiya.
Hello, Malcolm. My comment was really, and there's a lot of links here, but I didn't hear you really talking about what I would call the poor health and well-being profile of Scotland. And you could connect it to productivity. The Japanese have done a survey recently showing that you increase sport in the workplace for 50 employees were aged 50 and over, the productivity increases dramatically. But we have amongst the worst health profiles in Europe. And if we want to get anywhere, surely we're going to have to improve that. If we're not, a basic salary is not a bad thing, certainly, but happiness and well-being, to me, would be needing to be central, not peripheral.
Absolutely. And I haven't highlighted it separately, but it's absolutely all to do, in my opinion, it's all to do with education, being educated and getting a job. Because at the end of that is good for mental health. Now, we're talking about saying 1 million or 20% of our population may have underlying health conditions, which is a very high number. But, a revolution in education is not, in my opinion, about producing more doctors and lawyers for Scotland. It's actually a much more technical thing. It's a much more vocational thing. And it's certainly a much more holistic thing. And we need a whole revolution around physical education as much as we do in the classroom education, Charlie. So I would see that coming very much in the educational piece. And if we can get that fixed at our lower levels, our younger children, where there is an obesity crisis, if we can get all that fixed in our education system, that will have the knock-on effect through the economy. I didn't highlight it separately, but I totally agree with your sentiment.
Okay, I'm going to just select questions so that they give us a bit of a diversity, so we're not just going over the same things. Keith Stirling. Keith, are you with us?
This is my first chit chat on a Zoom.
There you go.
I joined one of your other chats and it was really good, but I shut up. And this time I was busy typing something. My key point, and thank you very much, I'm a bit on the hop. My key question is, what you say, I'm sure not everybody on the call will totally agree with most of what you say, but I, for one, agree with the vast majority of your 8 points. However, that's not the point. If you're standing for politics, you need to get people to vote. And what, in my opinion, and the more I think about this, I just want the right thing for Scotland. And Nicola Sturgeon is our Trump. She deflates all criticism. She never opens her mouth without blaming somebody, i.e. Westminster. And the people, after so many years of her doing that, people believe her. And with a passion, I genuinely don't understand what motivates her, because the drug one is the one that stands out for me. She doesn't really seem to care for Scotland. However, your challenge isn't on the economic basis, which we concur with, or I do. It's the psychological, emotional thing. Sorry, it's a long question.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I mean, I can agree. I agree with what you say about the votes point here, because it's a very frustrating situation I find myself in, where I'm not able to campaign. I'm not able to get out there. There's been no hustings. All we're doing is making telephone calls and stuffing leaflets through letterboxes. And you sort of think to yourself, how on earth can we be running such an important election where we can't actually talk to anybody? So I have my own frustration about that. And of course, one of the things the SNP have done is they are talking about command and control. They are the absolute experts in command and control, because they've effectively they centralise everything. All the devolution they call for from Westminster, they don't then push it down throughout Scotland. They've actually depowered the local councils. They've centralised the police force. The media in this country is effectively neutered. You know, so I agree that, but look, you know, we can't fix it. We've got to, you're right, we've got to get voices heard with an alternative point of view. I do believe the economy is key to it, and education, because we want well-educated, independently minded people who don't want to be told what to do, who don't think like robots, who have knowledge. That's the key thing in the Commission for School Reform, is that the curriculum for excellence is not, our children are not acquiring knowledge anymore. They're on some discovery thing, but not actually learning knowledge. We need a broader base society, which is not therefore going to be impressed by that sort of politician you just talked about.
Thank you. John Sturrock.
Yeah, I think the second of my questions has been picked up already. The first one, Malcolm, was talking about wealth creation and economic growth really has to be done probably unarguably or inarguably through the prism of net zero carbon and the future, which is net zero carbon. So what do you say about that in the context of Scottish economic prospects?
I mean, absolutely doable, you know, whether, you know, set the target, whether it's a 20, 30, 40, 50, and we've got COP coming to Glasgow. And again, we should be the world leaders in this. You know, we're the engineers of the world, right? So we're the guys that invented the steam engine. We're the guys that put the roads and canals out. This is just the next stage of this, you know, how you become, you know, eco-friendly, and how do we get ourselves to net carbon zero? We should be leading the charge on this. And it's back to, you know, National Investment Bank. That brief could be much bigger on this, and we could be investing quite significant taxpayers' money into this, sorting out our broadband, remote communities. Well, we've seen this through COVID. You can breathe new life into remote communities just by connectivity. People don't need to get their cars and travel in quite the same way as they used to. So I see it as absolutely central. Again, I haven't come at this with a big eco manifesto, but in my infrastructure piece, I see the infrastructure piece of this being the eco piece being absolutely central to that, and not to be scared of. Quite the opposite, to be embraced, and let's be world leaders as we should be in that field.
All right, Ewan Brown. Ewan, over to you.
Okay, well, first of all, Malcolm, all strength to your elbow, and I think you made the point at the beginning about business people being prepared to come into politics, albeit with all the difficulties that are around it. But I take my hat off to you entering the ring and wish you all the best. The point is, you mentioned the 14 years of SNP government failures. To me, it's not just that. Previous administrations failed us similarly from an economic point of view over a long period of time. And I just wonder here if the psyche of Scotland isn't that we've become, in a sense, subsidy junkies. Everything's coming to us. And therefore, do we not even need to move further than your 84% of tax raising powers to 100% of tax raising powers and get us off that hook altogether so that we begin to behave in quite different ways?
Can't argue with that. And as I said before, it's only in the last 20 years, maybe even in the last 10 years, that we've all become much more aware as a country of our national P&L. There's never been any focus on that, really. We've always just been the recipient of the Barnett formula and off you pop. And now actually there's an opportunity to actually be responsible and get ourselves into balance. This is the sort of the flip side of the independence argument, which is that, you know, Scotland needs a sharp shock. So if it went independent, it would actually have to sort itself out. That's sort of sometimes where the Tory Nats come at it, which is this idea that actually that would be hard medicine, but by God, we'd have to stand on our own 2 feet. My argument is that'd be far too drastic for us. A 15 billion hole. I mean, the cost of the NHS in Scotland as a whole is 15 billion, right? So we can't cover 15 billion anytime soon, and we don't have a currency that anybody trusts. So without those two levers, that would not be a sharp shock. That would be a heart attack. So, but the question is a good one, Keith, which is let's back to my signpost on Hart Hill. Let's get the man in the street talking about this. Where do we rank against the other 4 nations, the other 3 nations, other regions? How are we getting on in Scotland? Let's make it a source of national pride, how our economy works as much as anything else is a national pride. Change the conversation. It's a challenge, but that I think is what we need to do. And I agree with you that if you did go finally to the 100%, at what point do you get to a point where Holyrood stops blaming Westminster? When all that's happening is free money is coming over the border. You know, COVID alone, it's 13 billion. 13 billion with no questions asked. Free money coming over the border. And still we complain about it. You know, unbelievable. So yeah, you're right. That would be that is a more drastic method of doing it. And if we have to live within our means, you know, we go on with it, right?
Alison Payne.
Thanks. Malcolm, obviously Reform Scotland has done work around about devolving VAT and devolving corporation tax, and we definitely would be agreeing with you on these things. And we certainly agree that the Scottish Parliament needs more powers. We should be aiming to raise more of the money that we spend. However, this election is clearly dominated by yes or no, independence. It's clearly the status quo or independence. How do we get that debate that we need to have? How do we start having that conversation where everything is such a narrow debate at the moment?
Well, back to the situation we were in, we don't have hustings up and down the length and breadth of the country. There's no town halls open. There's no, there's no electioneering happening. So it's dominated by the sound bites we get in the national TV, maybe the odd national newspaper, and it's just coming down to a bun fight. You know, yes or no on independence. And the reason for this, and it's like all politics gets polarized, is that you know what it's like the US election when it comes down to sort of like 20,000 people that make a difference. You know, we've got this situation where we've got some undecided voters who are probably unionists, but flirting with independence. But they like the idea of the romantic idea of independence, but they're not sure they actually want it to happen in practical reality. And so all these focus groups come along and say, what you got to do is you got to turn, if you can turn that small percentage of undecideds, that's how you win it. And so we're now fighting a campaign based on focus groups. Sadly, it's not what I would want to be doing, but that's the reality where we are. If life gets back to normal, which it will, of course, the job of Holyrood and voices perhaps like mine will be to try and take the debate away from that. Get a positive case made for Scotland. There's no need for any negativity about Scotland. Scotland is an amazing country with incredible prospects. I'm just saying we can do all that within the UK. In fact, it's easier. If we can keep sterling been around 330 years where people are queuing up to buy our gilts, why would you trade that in for a currency that no one's heard of, where you've got to pay 5 times the you know, just as a business person, I say that's nuts. That's a crazy idea. So, but as a proud Scot, let's run our own affairs. Let's be independent, small I within the UK. Let's manage our own affairs, as Ewan said. Let's get our costs under control. Let's create let's do all that. But I just say, why bother? Yes, we can be independent, but why bother? Why bother when we can do it all within the UK?
Okay, I can sense Jim Sillars growling from here as you're making some of those points. I don't know, Jim, if you want to ask a question or say something at some point, but I'll just ask Joanna Mowat first, please.
Thanks.
Come to you next, Jim.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Malcolm. That was probably one of the most refreshing and exciting political interventions I've seen for quite a long time, because I think pre-2014 we had actually quite an exciting time in the Scottish Parliament. People were looking for new solutions. People worked together. It wasn't the bish and bosh of Westminster. It was about finding the consensus and working together across all parties. We've lost all of that since the independence referendum, and it's now an arid and sterile blame game where we're not all trying to work together, and that's at Holyrood level. I think it's at local government level, which I'm most familiar with. So how do we change that? I mean, you talked about that with Alison, but how do we all try, and can we do that without settling independence in some way or not? And will another election do that, or do we have to do something more to get back to that positive future? Because whoever's in power, I agree with you, create more wealth shouldn't be controversial. It should just be fundamental. Everyone should agree with that, because it gives us so much more opportunity to do different things. But can we do that without settling independence first?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question. I mean, look, we've got a third, we know that a third of the country are implacable nationalists and a third are implacable unionists, right? Roughly, and a third it's the killing grounds, a third in the middle, right? And you're never going to persuade the third diehards on either side. And you might say they're on the M25 going round in a circle and there's no exits, there's no way off. They just keep going round in a circle in opposite directions. And the question is, can we give them a slipstream? Can we give them a road to come off, to meet in the middle and compromise? And can we compromise this where we actually say that as a country, let's get the best of what people want for independence, which is to manage their own affairs, to stand proud in the world, to say we have a different culture perhaps than we do from the rest of the UK, but where we actually take advantage of what the UK can offer us. And so, is there a moderate ground in the middle where moderate nationalists can meet moderate unionists and say, look, actually, we can get most of what we want here within the UK? And Ewan's already alluded to it, which is ultimately a Holyrood that's got more accountability, more power, and is actually managing her own affairs, but that we are using the levers that we need in the UK. And that surely should be a conversation that sensible, like-minded, centrist people can have. And if we solve that problem, we can stop all this continual debate about one subject, instead talking about how to make this country great, which is what it should be. I nearly said make Scotland great again. But but there's so much we could talk about making Scotland a better place. But right now, Joe, we're stuck in this. We've got two sides on a roundabout with no exits. Let's give them some exits.
I should say, Joanna, that for this election, we always publish a manifesto before elections. And on this occasion, we're doing a cross-party manifesto. So we've gone through our research and we've looked at the areas where we think you could build a coalition across the parties behind. Some of it's short-term, some of it's long-term, some of it would have immediate impact, some would. But the idea that Holyrood was created to do politics slightly differently, and although it's possible to be quite sceptical about that, but nevertheless, it was managed at certain times, and I think we think that that would be a useful way to reconstitute the next Parliament. And so we put forward a bunch of ideas that more than one party could get behind. Anyway, worth keeping your eyes out for that when it comes out. Jim Sillars, would you like to?
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Right. Well, I'm far from growling, but before I explain why I'm not growling, everybody on this panel should realise that independence is now a factor in Scottish politics. It is not going to go away. The question is, can you do two things at once? If you had a pro-independence government, can it do other things at the same time? And I have spent the last 10 years in total frustration as I've watched the SNP government and the SNP membership intellectually hollowed out by the cult of personality, which devolves upon Nicola Sturgeon. We have very poor calibre people. If you went out into the street and asked people to name the Scottish Cabinet, they couldn't do so. And that tells its own story. Could they name an SNP backbencher who has said something that resonates outside of the independence issue? And the answer again would be no. So we're electing a parliament on the 6th of May for the next 5 years, in which the issue of independence will be involved. But that doesn't mean that other issues take lower priority. And Malcolm might be surprised. I don't disagree with anything he said on his 8 points of how to turbocharge us. I would like to see the Tory party stop going on about a referendum that isn't going to happen this year. And I'd like the next leaflet from the Tory party to tell me some of the things that Malcolm actually said. And I agree with him entirely on the question of education. I took the trouble to go and see Jim McCall's junior college, and it was a success. It wasn't an experiment. It was an experiment that was proven to be a success. And I regard it as a great tragedy that it wasn't replicated by the Scottish Government. And I think, why did that happen? I think we have an elitist problem in certain sections of the Scottish community. One of the reasons why we don't talk about wealth creation, because if you talk about wealth creation, there's somebody going to get very rich, and then a tendency for folk to say, "Oh, not too happy about that." But there's a contradiction here. When Henrik Larsson was banging the goals in for Celtic, he was on £48,000 a week in the East End of Glasgow, and nobody thought anything of that. If we could produce an elite 11 to win the World Cup, we would all absolutely celebrate. But when it comes to education, the last thing we want is to bring in any elite ideas. So we have an educational problem broadly among the Scottish community. I would also like to agree with him on the need to bring in corporation tax, capital gains tax, national insurance, and VAT. These are levers we don't have, but we absolutely need to have if we're really going to grow the Scottish economy. My final point is on infrastructure, and he'll bump up against the Greens on this. How do you open up Galloway? We've got areas of Scotland like Galloway, which are very poor, where talking about productivity is a laugh. Now, I'll give you an example. I went down to see Galloway. You go down to Stranraer on a single track railway. The road is dreadful. I needed a haircut. And I went in, and the man cut my hair, and I said, "How much is that?" And he said, £3.50. I said, "What?" He said, "Well, you're an old age pensioner." And I said, "Well, what would it be if I wasn't?" And he said, £5. And I said to the man, "How in the name of God is it 5? He said, "There's no money here." Now, how do you open up Galloway? You open it up with the road that goes towards Dumfries, and you open it up with the road that goes up towards Ayr in the A77. That kind of infrastructure is absolutely vital if we're going to bring Scotland into a better economic position. So I don't disagree with what Malcolm said. And I also agree that we need people from different walks of life in the Scottish Parliament. What we've got is a political class who were researchers for MSP. As a matter of fact, Hamza Yusuf is the outstanding example of that. And then we get the hate crime bill out of him. So if we don't have the ability to be able to see the flaws in this Parliament, then Malcolm can have as many of his 8 points as he like. They actually won't work. We need people in there who can bring world experience. And the reason for all this criticism of the SNP government, Malcolm said, have they any business acumen? Well, the answer is, if you look at the record, definitely no. And that's one of the reasons why, when it comes to the 6th of May, even though I'm a member of the SNP, I ain't voting for them.
Okay, well, bombshell there. Malcolm, last word.
Well, maybe that's the start of the conversation. Maybe we have to hold it over ourselves and work out where we find common ground. And actually, as I said before, if the SNP had actually, I'm sure Jim Sillis had been advising back then, saying, look, the best way to get promoted in a job is to prove you can do the job already, right? So the best way to get a pay rise is to demonstrate you're worth the money already. So the best way to get independence would have been for Scotland to have a government that managed her affairs in such a way as she could stand on her own 2 feet. We can argue, and we both want the same thing, therefore we want basically Scotland to be independent and prosperous and fair. We can then argue about whether that's inside the UK or not, but at least let's get Scotland to be more prosperous and more fair. And at the end of the day, that should be let's try and make that the conversation.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of what's been a really interesting and quite unusual hour, I think. Just a really fascinating conversation and interaction between the audience and Malcolm. I suppose we should wish you good luck, Malcolm. I know you're 5th on the list, so it'll be a bit of a struggle to maybe make it over the line. But I think there's a clear view that you know, the Parliament would be well served by having you there. Whether you'd be well served by being in Parliament is another question, perhaps. But so thanks again, Malcolm. I'll just, before we wrap up, say that we're publishing a report next week on immigration, and it's brilliant. It's one of the best things we've done at Reform Scotland, by Heather Macaulay, who's a real global expert on this stuff. So there'll be an event next Thursday to look at that. Please do attend. And we're also in conversation with First Minister. We're just trying to get a date, which I'm pretty sure we'll get in the next few days. So watch out for that. I'm sure that'll be well attended to. But again, thank you all for coming. Thanks for your questions, and thank you to you, Malcolm, for your time, and best of luck.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Bye now.